Hi, welcome to Gadabout United. My name's Adam, and today I want to focus on United's managers going back all the way to A.H. Albert in 1892. I want to have a very quick look through 5 metrics: win ratio, the time spent at club, silverware, style, quality and history whilst they were there, and the players that debuted under their regime, to then rank them in tier maker into 4 categories, whether they were the greatest, excellent, good, poor or just caretaker managers. I've decided not to put in more factors because it'll just make it more complicated, including years in top flight, because especially before the war that was quite a difficult challenge for many of the United managers, having very few funds and entering the job when United were in the second division, which is when we spend most of our time. Anyway, this is what it looks like, and you can see all across the bottom all the profiles of all the United managers going back to 1892, back to A.H. Albert, then James West, Ernest Mangnall, and T.J. Walworth doesn't have a picture because he was there only a couple of months to administer the club, at least in that capacity, and there's just no record of him. Then there's John Bentley, Jack Robson, John Chapman, Clara Hilditch, Herb Bamlett, Walter Crickmere, who had 2 spells either side of Scott Duncan, who's next, and then Sir Matt, Jimmy Murphy, who sadly took over when in the aftermath of the United Munich air disaster. Then Wilf McGuinness, Frank O'Farrell, Tommy Dock, Dave Sexton, Ron Atkinson, Fergie, and the rest. I think you all know who they are. Just before I start, I just want to make clear a few of the parameters. So obviously I mentioned the 5 categories earlier. Each manager can be scored between 1 and 5 marks on each of the categories. Some are a bit more mathematical or a bit more objective than others. So for instance, win ratio, longevity, the time spent at club, silverware, they're more on the math side, and I'll go into more detail once I start going through each of the managers and how they given marks. And then there's a little bit more, on my opinion, as to how many points they got for the style, the quality, the history, and I'll explain that when I go through, and also the stars, the players debuted under each manager's tenure. So again, that will be more subjective. There's no real way to give an objective mathematical formula for this. But anyway, all of it is subjective based on what I know, what I've researched of all of the managers from 1892 to Ollie. So starting with A.H. Albert, I'm going to put him into poor. Being the first manager of United, starting in the second division, a lot of the factors that would give him a higher rating don't really apply to him. He had a good win ratio, 44.56, which I've given him a mark of 3. I would give other higher marks if he'd got 50% or over, or 55% or more, but it's a solid 44.56, which puts him in tier 3 between 40 and 50%. He was there 8 years, which is decent longevity for a United manager. So he gets 3 marks for that. If he'd actually got another year, I'd put sort of 9 to 15, he'd have got 4 points. Silverware, see, now he doesn't actually win anything, but the fact that he came runner-up in one season, albeit the second division, in order to help weight it with the earlier pre-war managers where they only had 2 competitions, there was no League Cup, no Europe to play for, and also they had the adversity of many seasons in the second division. If they'd actually become runners-up in a trophy or tournament, or if they came runners-up in the league or even got promoted, I would give them half a point and round it up if the total wasn't a whole number. So, for instance, for Albert, he did get a runners-up. I've upgraded that by half to 1 mark more. So he gets the equivalent of 1 trophy, so he gets 2 marks. If he gets between 2 and 4 trophies, it would be 3, 5 and 9, 4, and 10 plus 5. So that's where he gets scores there. And then he spent most of his time in the 2nd division, so not really. And he was more of an administrator. He wasn't really a coach by what we understand as a coach in the last 60 years or even longer. All of these earlier managers were more administrators, most of them anyway. So he only gets 1 mark there, and the star players debuted: the Frederick Ernest, Cartwright, Harry Stafford, Joe Casti. It's very difficult. There's only a handful of players before the war that anyone actually knows anything about, like Billy Meredith, maybe Sandy Turnbull, scorer of the winner in the 1909 Cup final against Bristol City, maybe even Charlie Roberts. So it's not like today where we all know our heroes from all the different eras since the war. So I've given extra points if they've got a sufficient number of players who, or the top 100 appearances for United, or their top scorers for United, and therefore they'll get more points for their manager. So he gets actually a total of 11, and he makes this grade poor. Okay, so next we're going to go to James West, who took over from Albert in 1900 and reigned for 3 years. Now, I'm not going to go into all the minutiae with the following pre-war managers because it's just going to get bogged down, but I think I gave through the description of Albert's achievements and what he did or lack thereof, what we should be looking for. Well, James West seems to be a poorer version of that. Spent his 3 years in the lower divisions, only with a win ratio of 40.71%, no silverware, and not really any players worth mentioning. And so he gets 8 points, and again, he goes into the poor category. Next up is Ernest Mangnall. Now, he was the first manager to get any sort of success, and also to be a bit more of a strategist. He reigned from 1903, from the October up to August 1912, when he went over to City, of all clubs. And he did very, very well for United and set the basis for our early success, or was the only basis for our early success, to be more accurate. He got a great win ratio with 54.16, so he gets 4 out of 5 for that. He was there 9 years. His silverware, he won 2 league titles and also a charity shield. He got promoted, and with all of that success, he gets 4 marks. He was known for good attacking football, attacking players. He's the one who brought Billy Meredith to the club from City, and so he gets a few marks for that. And also, he's the one who brought in other names that you might have heard of: the Charlie Robertses, Sandy Turnbulls, Dick Duckworth, that sort of calibre of player. And altogether, he gets a nice total of 18 marks, and he is actually going into the 2nd grade for United. After he left for City, it was under administration, that position, for a couple of months through TJ Woolworth, who I mentioned earlier, that we have very little photographic evidence, at least, of what he did. And as a temp, he goes straight into the caretaker manager position. Not really worth looking at his stats because he didn't really do very much in those couple of months. After Walworth came John Bentley. He only stayed at the club a couple of years, had very little interest in running the team, and was more of an administrator like most of them in those days. And there's not much point talking about his statistics because they were fairly poor and inauspicious. So he only got 8 points in my book, again as a poor manager. He was then taken over by Jack Robson, who reigned for 7 years, from the end of 1914 to October 21. Most of that was during World War One, and he was even worse, very poor win ratio, less than 30%. Although he did bring in some decent players. Joe Spence, one of our record goal scorers, reigned in that era. He brought in Clary Hilditch, also known as Lal Hilditch, who became player manager. I'll speak about him shortly. And there was also several other players he brought in that were half decent and actually are quite high in the list of appearance makers for our club. But he was notoriously tight-fisted, but there's very little evidence he was a decent manager at all. Again, he makes about 8.5 points and is another poor manager. After him came a man called John Chapman, who reigned for 5 years and again did very little. He got promoted and he also brought in, although he did bring in some good players, Harry Rowley, Charlie Moore, Frank Mann, Thomas Jones. The thing about him was he was suspiciously suspended by the FA for improper conduct, so we still don't know what he did. It could be, I don't even want to suggest. So he left in disgrace and in a cloud of controversy. And even though he got 10 points, which is not too far off the second tier, the fourth tier, the second from bottom tier, he still falls into the poor management category. This is where Clary Hilditch, who I just mentioned, came in. He was the first player manager for United. He was there for about 6-7 months and didn't do very well at all. The side nearly got relegated, and he's pretty much the worst manager I've put in this system. He got 5 points, the lowest marks you can get. Obviously, he was there. I suppose he could be easily a caretaker manager, but I'm going to put him as a permanent manager. And he goes again into poor. He was taken over by Herb Bamlett for 4 years, from April 1927 to November 1931. Again, he had a very poor win ratio. He had 12 successive defeats and was relegated. Didn't really bring in any decent players or any players that we remember, like the Billy Merediths and the Joe Spences. And he was just 1 mark above Hilditch in my book, and again, he's poor. He was then taken over by a caretaker manager, Walter Crickmere, who unfortunately perished at Munich in '58 in the position of club secretary. Now, he had 2 periods. He's the first manager to have 2 periods at United in charge of the first team. The first one is this one between 1931 and August 32. The second one was after the next manager, Scott Duncan, who I'll speak about shortly, left the club, and his second period was between 1937 and during the war up to February 1945. Now, he's strictly called a caretaker manager, but altogether you've got about 9 years there. So I'm going to judge him as a proper manager. Maybe that's unfair, maybe not. His main claim to fame, and something that we should be very grateful to him for, was the he instituted the youth academy at United that gave rise to the foundation of our emphasis on youth, the Busby Babes, class of 92, all of that, and everyone in between. We're very well known for bringing through young players. And so he actually did okay. Still only a poor. He got 11 points because he didn't win anything. I think got promoted once. And didn't really bring in any players. Just Thomas Manley comes under the top 100 appearance makers for United that fell under his tenureship. So we're going to move on to Scott Duncan after putting Walter in to poor. Maybe unfairly, maybe fairly. That's for you to decide. And Scott Duncan took United on through the very tough depression years of 1932 to 37. He had a win ratio just under 40%, so he gets a couple of marks for that. He was there 5 years, as I say, and he got promoted, but then got relegated. But there was very little money available to him and United in that era. We nearly went bust again. And his claim to fame is he brought in some really important players that Samat then used as the start of his first great team When he became manager in February 1945, he brought in the likes of Johnny Carey, who captained the 48 FA Cup winning side, our first trophy in almost 30 years. The amazing goal scorer Jack Rowley and Stan Pearson, a great goal scorer. He brought in Walter Winterbottom, whose name might sound familiar because he was the manager of England just before Sir Alf Ramsey. He also brought in George Vose and William McKay, who are record appearance makers for United. They're in the top 100. And so Scott Duncan has actually moved into the good category. He got 12 points and he puts him in tier 3. So well done to him. Next up is Sir Matt. Obviously, he is going straight into tier 5. All of the categories, he gets almost top marks. He got a win ratio of 51.42%, which is his only slight failing and puts him in 4 as a mark out of 5. His longevity of 25 years, maximum points. His trophy haul of 13 major trophies. I'm including charity shields in this. And 7 runners-up, either second in the league or runners-up in cup finals. Actually gives him another 3.5 points. And so easily makes that quota for top marks for Silverware. Do we need to speak anything about what he achieved at the club or how they played, the attacking flair, the emphasis on youth, taking United into Europe, all massive things over that period. And then he created 3 amazing sides. The first side that was just post-war with Charlie Mitten, Johnny Delaney, who he brought from Celtic. Dennis Violet started around that side and then got merged into the Busby Babes. And that first side, the one just post-war, came runners-up on several occasions and only won 1 FA Cup, albeit that the side probably deserved to win a little bit more and just was the wrong side of fortunate. Obviously, the second side, the Busby Babes, possibly the greatest United side that we had, and we just don't know how well they could have done. They could have dominated Europe for years, maybe even knocked on to England's success or better England's success with the quality that we lost of Duncan Edwards, of Roger Byrne, of Eddie Coleman. All these young lads could have played for England and others. So that was the second team, and then the final team, the side that won the European Cup and won a couple of leagues in the 60s and the FA Cup. So you've got the holy trinity of Best and Charlton, Paddy Crerand, Nobby Stiles, brought Brian Kidd in there, David Hurd, and then near the end Willie Morgan. And he also brought in Johnny Giles, who he let go. I think that was one of his main regrets, letting someone of that calibre go to Leeds, and he had tremendous success over there. And again, it's another 5, so Matt gets 24 out of 25 for me. And he obviously moves into the top spot for his 2 periods, from 45 to 69 and from 70 to 71. You could argue 3 periods, because I'm going to speak about Jimmy Murphy next. But only as a caretaker, he was in charge of United for the 4 months after Munich and up to the end of the season, where he took the club to the FA Cup final, and we were barged out of it in the end, and we lost to Bolton and that Loft House. And so Jimmy will go into the caretaker position. And then after Sir Matt's main retirement in 69, we had a Busby Babe, a former Busby Babe, Wilf McGuinness, who thankfully is still with us. And he took over for just over a year between 69 and 70. But possibly because of the shadow of Sir Matt still hanging around, I think Sir Matt still kept his office at the club, which is fairly undermining of someone like Wilf McGuinness. They felt that Wilf McGuinness could, after knowing the club so well, the players so well, really carry on where Sir Matt left off. Didn't work out like that. He only brought in Shea Brennan, so he doesn't really get any points for that. He wasn't there a long time. His win ratio was... So he didn't bring in Shea Brennan. He brought in Ian Urie. And his win ratio was 36.76. he didn't really achieve much in that short period, and so he only gets 8.5 points, and Wilf goes into Port, unfortunately. Taking over from him was another manager who felt the firm hand of Sir Matt above him, and that's Frank O'Farrell, who had done very well at Leicester City, but couldn't repeat it at United. He was there just over a year, year and a half actually. Had a poor win ratio. I mean, it started very well for him, and then he just fell off by Christmas 71. Didn't have a great style. Had to take over from an ageing, cliquey squad, and he couldn't get past Sir Matt's influence and move players on that he felt weren't young enough or worthy enough to play anymore. But he did bring in the likes of Martin Buchan, who was very heavily criticised for at the time, who became United captain and lifted the cup in 77 under Tommy Docherty, Sammy McElroy, Story Moore and Wyn Davis. So he didn't really have a great success at United, and I've given him 7.5 points. And again, that is in the poor category. Up next was a manager who was as uncompromising as he was sharp and witty, and that was our poor, recently departed Tommy Dock. He was at the club about 4.5 years, and if you look at Twitter and the people who lived through that era, they think that's probably the best era they've ever seen since they started watching it. The attacking flair is 5 out of 5. The way they played, they could win by 4 or lose by 4 on any given Saturday. He joked Tommy about the lack of defence that they focused on. They focused purely on attack, which was wonderful for that era, albeit got the heart going a bit too much. And that sort of accounts for a good to mediocre win ratio of just under 47%. He won a couple of trophies. He won the FA Cup. Also got promoted, that counts as half a trophy. Also he shared the Charity Shield, so I counted that. So he gets a few points for trophies. His longevity wasn't great, so he doesn't really capitalise on that. And I've given him 4 out of 5 for the quality of players he brought in. He brought in the heroes like Lou Macari, Pancho Pearson, the Greenough brothers, Stuart Houston, or Houston should I say, Coppell, Hill, Albiston, who was there forever and well into the era I started watching under Bigger On. And he was a fantastic manager, and he actually gets 17 points according to me, which puts him in excellent second level for United. And if he hadn't gone prematurely for personal reasons, maybe United could have produced Silverware winning football, but he wasn't given the opportunity after the 77 success, and instead that befell Dave Sexton. Dave Sexton, and something that he was heavily criticised when you compare him to Docherty, he played very dour, dull football, which gives him only a couple of points when it comes to that sort of style metric that I've put in there. He was only at the club 4 years. He was very solid in the fact that he got to a cup final. He came second to Liverpool in the league. He won his last 7 games and then got fired. And he was a decent manager, a decent man, but not very interesting. The win ratio was a lot less than the Docks. It was just over 40%, 40.3. But he did bring in some quality players. He brought in the likes of Ray Wilkins, Joe Jordan, Gordon McQueen, Gary Bailey, most people's heroes, a goalkeeper in the 80s, and Kevin Moran. But he was very mediocre in many of the senses you can think of it, of that, using that word. And he only got 13 points. That puts him in tier 3 as a good manager. He was solid, but nothing special and nothing poor. And then you got Big Ron taking over from him, more in the Tommy Dock mould than the Dave Sexton mould, with his quips and the attacking flair of his side. Maybe not as attacking and flair driven as Docherty's side, so I gave him 4 for that. But certainly the quality he brought in, the likes of Robson, Whiteside, Muren, Strachan and Olsen, Sparky, my favourite player of all time for United, Frank Stapleton. And that certainly was probably one of the best sides we ever had that never won a title. We just didn't have that final Cantona-esque element or luck with injuries that could have propelled us forward, especially in the 85-86 season. His win ratio was very solid, 50%, and he was there maybe a bit too, he left a bit too soon, but United were really lagging. I think they'd hit the peak under him by that time. But he won 2 FA Cups. He came runners-up, runners-up in the League Cup, won the Charity Shield, and so he gets 18 points, and he goes into the excellent tier. Following on from him in November 86 is probably the manager that you all know the most, or the most about, or have seen the most of, and that's Sir Alex. He reigned, as you know, from 86 to 2013, so he gets 5 points for longevity, the longest serving United manager. He also at a win ratio of almost 60%, which, if you remember the early days of Fergie, that's quite remarkable to get it up to that level. He gets 5 points for that. Furthermore, he won 38 trophies of all kinds, including Charity Shields, and was runner-up on no fewer than 15 occasions. That's 7.5 more points, so he gets full marks for that. I think if you were watching the likes of Konchelsky, Sharp, Giggs, Ronaldo, Rooney, etc., 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 attacking and flair is definitely a 5. Yes, there were some mediocre, turgid affairs, but most of the time you knew that you were going to enjoy watching United play, and that's what gained United a lot of respect. It was never 1-0 to United like it was to the Arsenal in the early 90s, and they took pride in that. We took pride in winning and playing beautiful United-esque football. He truly carried over the legacy of Sir Matt that was emulated by the Doc and Ron Atkinson. And so he gets 25 points, and he is also in the greatest ever tier with Sir Matt. Unfortunately, following him was David Moyes, his natural successor, someone who he handpicked by all accounts, someone he saw something of himself in him. But he only lasted about 8 months. His win ratio was decent, 52.94%, but he went out cheaply of the Champions League in the quarter-finals, even though he had a tremendous win over Bayer Leverkusen. But he didn't get the support of the board. He only could bring in another favourite of mine, Juan Mata, but Fellaini was a last-minute, last-second signing in the August. He never got any sort of support with that, and he brought in Adnan Januzaj, who was a nice player for a short amount of time before he moved on, and so he doesn't really get any points from me for bringing these players in. Just gets the minimum 1, and the football he played was good at some points, turgid at others, and so for me he gets 11 marks and falls into that poor tier, and he's the last manager, in my opinion, that will get that score. After him, for the final, I think, 4 games of the 2014 season, Ryan Giggs came in, and as a caretaker, he goes straight into that tier. There's no point speaking very much about what he did because he wasn't there very long. Louis van Gaal took over the club in May that year, and I've got to say, since I started watching United under Big Ron, the football I saw under Van Gaal was some of the most turgid and dour football I've seen, which really surprised me as a former Ajax, former Barca boss, that the football we were playing was terrible. I mean, he brought in some good players. He brought in Blint, he debuted Rashford, he brought in Di Maria, Pogba's, he was debuted under him, Memphis Depay played. He brought Martial in, who's obviously he's played pretty well in my opinion. Not perfect, but pretty good. He brought in Falcao, Schweinsteiger, Shaw. These were decent enough players, and we still played poor football. So he doesn't score very well on the type of style, the quality. He was allowed to spend money, unlike Moyes, but these weren't players that will last the test of time in our memory. So, I mean, Rashford surely will, and Martial, but the rest, including Lingard, not so much, unfortunately. So he only gets a few points for that. His longevity was poor, but he did win the FA Cup, so he gets a couple of points.
and he goes into, or just scrapes into, the good category, the second from bottom tier if you don't include caretaker managers. And then he was taken over quite ruthlessly by Jose Mourinho. I'm not blaming Jose, I'm blaming the board, because I think if you saw Van Gaal interviewed, especially after winning the cup, I think he was the only person who didn't realise that Mourinho was going to take over from him. But he did, and Mourinho only lasted a couple of years, and again, remarkably turgid dour football from him. It was atrocious. I remember the 0-0 at West Brom we played. I think that was the worst game I've ever seen United play, or the worst as a spectacle. But his win ratio was superb. It was 58.33%. That's a 5 level ratio. He won some trophies. He won the Europa League, the League Cup. He came runner-up in the league with a really mediocre side, a side that was not cooperating under the auspices of, I think Paul Pogba was the main leader in that. But he brought in some decent players. Bailly, Zlatan was a revelation. Lukaku, when Zlatan was playing, it wasn't turgid, but most of the time it was. He was injured for most of the season that he was brought in. Sanchez didn't work out. It was an awful signing. Mkhitaryan didn't quite make it. Fred was not his best at the beginning, nor Matic. Lindelof was okay. And it just wasn't a great time to watch United, although we did win a couple of trophies. And so he only gets 13 points and is also in the good category. And finally, Ole Gunnar Solskjaer. Now, Ole's going to suffer from the problem that he's only been there a couple of years, so he's not going to get many points for that. He's not won any trophies, he's not been runner-up, so he's not going to get anything for this. But I do like his football. At the beginning, when he started and he took over as caretaker manager, the football was excellent. It's like looking back at a Fergie side. And in the last handful of games, or the last couple of months of 2020, we were seeing what we're capable of, bringing in the likes of Bruno and Greenwood making his debut, Cavani looking good. We have some potential there, but again, he's not been there long enough for them to be, names that will live forever. I'm sure Bruno will. I hope Greenwood will be as well. Maguire's not really done it, so it's not really going to get a lot of points for there. His style is going to get points. The win ratio 56.03 when this video has been made is also a tier 5 level of performance, but with the no trophies and the lack of longevity, he's only getting 14 points, and that means he is also a good. Disagree or not, he could be brilliant. He could be in the greatest ever. Only time will tell. I'm not sure many people watching this video will agree. Anyway, that's it. That's the full list, the full tier of United managers. You can see who's in the greatest, the excellent, the good, the poor columns, and you can decide for yourself. Please comment below and let me know what you think, but also please like, share and subscribe. That would mean a lot and will help the channel grow.